Good afternoon. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Friday, Yom Shishi, a good and Erev Shabbos. We can't wait for Shabbos. Shabbos can't come soon enough. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house on a Friday? Yehudit in South Carolina, Shandor in the Bronx, Sharon in New Jersey, Gordo in Scotland. Welcome. Chaim in Florida, Aoife in Florida, Elle is in the house, Patrice in Utah. Welcome, everybody. Today is day 154 since the hostages went into captivity. Please, God, may they be released now. Bring them home now. Bring them home now. Let them spend Shabbos with their families. And we dedicate our learning today. May they be released soon, and may the war end with a secure and lasting peace for everyone in the Holy Land. We say Amen. Let's do this. Our daf today is page 9, daf Tes, here in Tractate Bava Metzia, the 22nd volume of the Talmud. And we're finally, is it today? Yeah, right. Today we're going to complete our discussion of Mishnah number 1 here in chapter 1. So one of the items that the Mishnah mentioned is this idea. It started with two people are holding a garment. Each claims they found it. Each claims they're entitled to complete possession of it. And the court ends up saying to them, swear an oath that you own no less than half of it. And then they split it. They sell the garment and divide the proceeds. The Mishnah also said that two people who are riding an animal and both said that they found it and they're entitled to it, swear an oath, and then they sell the animal and divide the proceeds. And this also applies if one person is riding it and one person is pulling the reins, and both said they found it. And so we got into a discussion of how you acquire, right? How you make a formal act of acquisition, a kinyan. And this would be applicable both in the situation where somebody sells a utensil. I sell you this pen, right? So I put it down, you pick it up. Whether you paid me the money or not, we made a deal, and you don't actually, it doesn't pass from my possession into yours until you lift the pen, right? That's the formal act of acquisition. If I'm selling you an animal, so then the kinyan is that you take, for example, the reins of the animal and pull it. It just goes one step, but a witness could see that you took control of the animal. With a donkey, which is typically driven from behind with a prod or like a stick and kind of direct the donkey, but usually the donkey driver walks behind the donkey, so fine. So he makes the donkey move from behind by using a little stick to prod it a little bit. He exercised control over the donkey. And yesterday we were talking about, what about one who is sitting on the animal? Is it enough to mount the animal, to sit on top of the animal in order to acquire the animal? And we said, well, there's a difference between purchase and sale of an animal and one who finds an ownerless animal, right? So for purchase and sale, you could just hand the reins to someone. A witness could see that you handed the reins. But simply picking up the reins of an ownerless animal, nobody transferred them into your hand, so that's not enough. You have to make the animal move. What about sitting on top of the animal? We're going to talk more about that today. Some would say just sitting on the animal doesn't mean anything, but sitting on the animal and making it move in a direction, that's how you acquire. Others will say just sitting on the animal is enough. So let's see. We're right at the bottom of page 8b. Come and hear a proof from a Baraisa. With regard to two people who were pulling a camel or driving a donkey together, right? They did it together. Or one who was pulling it and one who was driving it. Now we're on 9a. They have both acquired the animal in that manner. And Rabbi Yehuda says, and again, when we talk about finding an ownerless animal, this is either because, now normally if you find a lost object, you have to return it. You have to make every effort to make sure that it goes back to its original owner. But there are certain circumstances where there is no owner to be found. One example was the convert, who dies without leaving any heirs. So there is no family for this. He's dead. There is no family for it to pass, the property to pass to. So it becomes ownerless. And when it's ownerless, that is like a found object. There's no owner to return it to, so whoever claims it first is going to gain possession of that animal. Again, by making the kinyan, right? So here it's saying that if two people make the kinyan at the same time, they're going to acquire it together, and so they could sell the animal and divide the proceeds. Now, Rabbi Yehuda says, in this case of one who is pulling and one who is driving, right? Or one who was pulling it and one who was driving it, Rabbi Yehuda says actually one acquires an animal only through pulling in the case of a camel or driving in the case of a donkey, as that is the manner in which they are normally directed. So in any event, it is taught in the Baraisa, or one who was pulling and one who was driving, which indicates that pulling and driving are indeed effective modes of acquisition, but sitting in a riding position on top of the animal is not. So the Gemara rejects this inference. The same is true with regard to even sitting in a riding position on an animal. It is an effective mode of acquisition, and the reason that the Baraisa teaches specifically the modes of pulling and driving, this is only to exclude the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, who says that one acquires an animal only through pulling in the case of a camel or driving in the case of a donkey. Therefore, the first Tana teaches us that even in the opposite manner, even if you pull a donkey or drive a camel, you do acquire the animal. And the Gemara asks, if that is so, then let the first Tana of the Baraisa combine the cases and teach them as follows. With regard to two people who were pulling or driving either a camel or a donkey, they each acquired the respective animal. The fact that this wording was not used indicates that the first Tana does not entirely disagree with Rabbi Yehuda. So now the Gemara modifies its response. There is one manner of acquisition by which the first Tana concedes to Rabbi Yehuda that one does not acquire the animal, meaning if one employs it, and it is unclear what manner that is. So some say that by pulling a donkey, one does not acquire it, as donkeys tend to not move at all when being pulled. And some say that by driving a camel, one does not acquire it, as that is not the common way to move it. And according to an alternative version of this discussion, there are those who raise an objection to the opinion that one can acquire an animal by sitting on it in a riding position. From the latter clause of the statement of the first Tana in the Baraisa, they acquire the animal in that manner. And the phrase "in that manner" is stated to exclude what? Is it not to exclude one who sits in a riding position on the animal? And the Gemara answers no. It is stated to exclude the opposite cases. One who drives a camel or one who pulls a donkey does not acquire the animal because that's not the normal way. And, it's a sort of, a car. They didn't have cars, right? But you can almost hear them saying, well, how do you acquire a car? One way would be to hand over the keys. That's probably what we do these days. But maybe that's not enough. Right? Probably that is enough because that's like handing over the reins. But if it was an ownerless car and you just picked up the keys, is it enough to pick up the keys, or do you have to make the car move, right? And so if you got behind the steering wheel, started the car and moved it, even a few inches, it would seem, well, you took control of the car. But if you just sat in the passenger seat, did you gain control of the car? One would think not. Now, about this distinction between, pulling a camel and driving a donkey, there's an interesting note here. Where is it? Where'd it go? A camel and a donkey. So the difference between, this is a note from Rav Steinsaltz, the difference between pulling a camel and driving a donkey is due both to the nature of these animals and the way that they are trained to be led. A donkey tends to be driven, i.e. the donkey walks in front, followed by its driver, who holds a prod with which he directs the donkey. And a camel cannot be driven in that way. Instead, a halter or a nose peg is placed on its nose, and the leader walks in front of it and pulls it. This difference was so well known that the sages describe a person who holds a self-contradictory position in the Gemara as a donkey driver and a camel driver, right? So somebody who's contradicting himself is somebody that would be called both a camel driver and a camel driver. And what they mean by that is, like, what you're saying makes no sense. You have contradicted yourself in a kind of a colorful way to describe such a person. Where does the law end up, by the way, on this question? If two people, so this is the halakha, right? If two people see a lost donkey and both drive it or pull it, or one pulls it and one drives it, both acquire the donkey. In the case of an ownerless animal, if both pull it or both drive it, they acquire the camel. But if one pulls it and the other drives it, only the one who pulls it acquires it. And this ruling is apparently based on the latter opinion mentioned in the Gemara, which states that by driving a camel, one does not acquire it. And on the understanding that this is referring only to a case where one person is pulling the camel at the same time that the other person is driving it. So under normal circumstances, if you seek to acquire an ownerless animal, as long as you make it move, whether by pushing it, prodding it, or pulling it, you acquire the animal. But if two people are sort of competing to acquire it, then the one who is going to pull it, or who's going to move it in its customary manner, is going to have precedence over someone who clearly doesn't know what they're doing and is trying to make it move from another direction because he didn't get the reins, right? And so his effort is sort of nonsensical in that situation. Okay. Now the Gemara asks, if so, that is identical to the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, right? Rabbi Yehuda says one acquires an animal only by pulling it in its normal way of pulling the camel or driving the donkey. So the Gemara answers there is a practical difference between them with regard to one manner of acquisition in which one does not acquire the animal. And some say that according to the first Tana, by pulling a donkey, one does not acquire it. And some say that by driving a camel, one does not acquire it. So come in here a proof from a Baraisa that one can acquire an animal by sitting on it in a riding position. If one person is sitting in a riding position on a donkey and one person is holding the reins, then this one, the one sitting on the donkey, acquires the donkey. And that one, the one holding its reins, also and that one holding the reins acquires the reins. And learn from it that one who sits in a riding position on an animal does acquire it, right? It was interesting. So one who's sitting on the donkey and one is pulling its reins. So if they, it was ownerless when they found it. So the one that climbed aboard, he acquired the donkey. And the one that picked up the reins, he acquired the reins. Now the Gemara rejects this. Here too, the reference is to one who is not only sitting on the donkey, but is also driving it with his feet by squeezing it or kicking it. He's not passively sitting there. He's making the donkey move. And the Gemara asks, if so, then the one who is sitting should acquire part of the reins too. The fact that he does not acquire the reins indicates that his acquisition of the donkey is imperfect, which would not be the case if he were driving it. And the Gemara answers, amend the text and say, this one acquires the donkey and half the reins, and that one acquires half the reins. So the Gemara asks, granted, the one sitting on the donkey acquires half of the reins because a mentally competent person, the one holding the reins, has lifted it for him. But in what manner does the one holding the reins acquire half the reins? The other end of the reins is attached to the donkey, and because he does not acquire the donkey, he cannot acquire the reins. And the Gemara answers, amend the text and say, this one, the one sitting on the donkey, acquires the donkey and almost all of the reins, and that one who is holding the reins acquires only the part of the reins that is actually in his hand. And the Gemara asks, what is the basis for this understanding? Even if you say that in a case of one who performs an active acquisition by lifting a found item on behalf of another, that the other person acquires ownership of the item, that statement applies only in a case where one lifts an item with the intention that another person will acquire it. In the case here, this person who is holding the reins is lifting them with the intention of acquiring them for himself. Since he himself does not acquire them, how can he acquire for others? And Rav Ashi said, amend the Baraisa and say, this one who is sitting on the donkey and driving it, he acquires the donkey and its halter, which is attached to its head. And that one who is holding the reins acquires only the part that is held in his hand. And with regard to the rest of the reins, the part of the reins that is neither attached to the donkey's head nor held in the person's hand, neither this one nor that one has acquired it. And Rabbi Bahu said, actually, do not amend the Baraisa. Leave it as it is taught. The one holding the reins acquires them because he can detach them from the donkey and bring them toward himself. Since he is able to pull the reins into his possession, they are considered his even though he does not lift them. And the Gemara comments, and this statement of Rabbi Bahu is in error. As if you do not say so, but instead accept Rabbi Bahu's opinion, that would result in an incorrect halakhic ruling in the case of a garment, half of which was lying on the ground and half of which was lying on a pillar. And one came and lifted the half of it that was on the ground off the ground. And another person came and lifted the other half off the pillar. So in that case, should one also rule that the one acquires the garment and the other one does not acquire it, since the first one was able to detach it from the pillar and bring the entire garment toward him? This is certainly not the law. Rather, clearly, this statement of Rabbi Bahu is in error. In any event, the question of whether one can acquire an animal by sitting on it in a riding position is unresolved. We have not established that yet. And by the way, where was the law on this case that we just discussed? If two people attempt to acquire an ownerless animal, one by sitting on it and the other by holding its reins, the one sitting on the animal acquires it, and the one holding the reins acquires the part of the reins that he is holding. And that is in accordance with the opinion of Rav Ashi. That's where the law ended up. Now, let's continue the discussion. The Gemara suggests, come in here an additional proof from a Baraisa. Rabbi Eliezer says, if one sits on an animal in the field or leads an animal in the city, he acquires it, right? So outside of the city, just by sitting on it, you acquire it. In the city, you have to lead it, okay? And that's, if it was ownerless, that's how you acquire it. And this proves that one can acquire an animal by sitting on it, at least in the field. The Gemara rejects this proof. Here too, the reference is to one who leads, i.e. drives the animal with his feet, not just sitting on it and making it move. The Gemara asks, if so, that is the same as leading the animal. Why would the Baraisa mention the same case twice? And the Gemara answers, the Baraisa is discussing two different types of leading the animal. So the Gemara asks, if that is so, what is the reason that one who sits on an animal in the city, right? It said only one who sits on an animal in the field. What about one who sits on an animal in the city? Why does he not acquire it? Rav Kahana said it is because people do not normally ride in the city, as it is crowded. Which I find interesting, because if you're riding the animal, aren't you taking up less space than if you're leading it? But maybe it's a little bit dangerous to ride an animal in the midst of crowds where the animal could get spooked and hurt somebody. So it's safer to lead the animal through a crowd. Rav Ashi said to Rav Kahana, if that is so, that by means of an unusual action one cannot effect an acquisition, then if one lifted a purse that he found on Shabbos, has he also not acquired it? Since people do not normally lift a purse on Shabbos due to the prohibition known as muktzah, set aside, we don't touch money on Shabbos because there's nothing we can do with money on Shabbos, so we don't even touch it. So what if you did touch it? If it was ownerless property and you lifted it? So you violated Shabbos, but did you acquire the money? So this is clearly not the law, meaning that he did acquire the money. So rather, how should one rule in that case? Well, what he did, and he acquires the purse. Here too, if one sat on an animal in the city, what he did, and he acquires the animal. It's not the normal way of doing things, but doesn't he acquire the animal anyway? So rather, the Baraisa is not referring to the case of a found animal, which one can acquire it even by sitting on it in the city. In fact, we are dealing with a case of buying and selling an animal, where the seller said to the buyer, acquire the animal the way that people normally acquire an animal. So therefore, the buyer cannot acquire it in the city by sitting on it, just because the seller said, make your acquisition in the normal way. In other words, the seller's from somewhere else. He says, I'm not sure what your custom is here, so acquire the animal by using the local custom. And the local custom is that people don't sit on their animals in the city, so that was not the normal custom. The acquisition hasn't been done yet. Now we're on page 9b. And if he rides it in the public domain, he acquires it, as people commonly ride animals in the city's public domain. And if he is an important person who always rides his animal rather than leading it, then he acquires it even in an alleyway. And if the buyer is a woman, she acquires the animal, as women do not normally lead animals. And if the buyer is a detestable person who rides even where other people do not, he too acquires the animal. there's a strong word. One who rides even where others do not, he is detestable. But if that is his custom, he can acquire the animal by riding. Now, next subject. Rabbi Elazar raises a dilemma with regard to one who says to another to whom he wishes to sell vessels, pull this animal in order to acquire the vessels that are upon it. Then what is the law? Very interesting. So the seller has a bunch of vessels, let's say pots and pans, that are attached to a donkey. Now, he's not selling the donkey and the pots and pans. He's just selling the pots and pans. But he wants to just make a quick sale. He doesn't want the guy to have to lift every single pot. All the pots are currently loaded on the donkey. So he says, okay, acquire all the vessels by pulling the donkey. Can this be done? Before discussing the dilemma, the Gemara is going to clarify the issue. If the vendor merely says, in order that you will acquire the vessels, how can the buyer acquire them? Did he say to him in the imperative, acquire the vessels? Without the seller's explicit instructing the buyer to acquire the vessels, the buyer cannot acquire them. Rather, Rabbi Elazar's dilemma is with regard to a case where the seller says to the buyer, pull this animal and thereby acquire the vessels that are upon it. So then what is the law? Is pulling the animal effective in order to acquire the vessels upon it or not? Right? So it was one is pull it. Pull it to acquire the vessels. The other is if you pull it, you will acquire the vessels, right? That's the difference. But it's assuming it's the latter, right? If you pull the animal, you will acquire the vessels. So Rava says this is clearly not effective, as if he said to him, acquire the animal and acquire the vessels. Does the buyer acquire the vessels? Although one can acquire an item by having it placed in his courtyard, and one's animal is considered the equivalent of his courtyard, nonetheless, it is a mobile courtyard, and a mobile courtyard does not affect acquisition of items that are placed in it. And if you would say that the animal can function as a courtyard when it is standing still, not walking, while being pulled, isn't there a principle which states that anything that does not affect acquisition when moving also does not affect acquisition when it is standing or sitting? Now, this idea of your courtyard can acquire for you, right? So instead of having to lift, if somebody deposits property, that you paid for, and they deposit it in your courtyard, okay, so your courtyard acquired that property for you. It's yours now. You don't have to do an act of lifting. It's been deposited in your courtyard, right? But a mobile courtyard is not going to function that way because of other considerations. Now, and the Gemara concludes, and the law is that the buyer can acquire vessels by having them placed on the animal's back only when the animal is tied up. In that circumstance, when the buyer acquires the animal, it assumes the legal status of his courtyard, and he also acquires the items that are placed upon the animal because it is stationary. It's not a mobile courtyard. So Rav Papa and Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yehoshua, said to Rava, if that is so, in a case where one was sailing on a boat and fish jumped and fell into the boat, is the boat also considered a mobile courtyard, and therefore he does not acquire the fish? And Rava said to him, a boat is not considered a mobile courtyard, as the boat itself sits idle, and it is the water that moves it. Now, that's kind of an odd thing to say, unless it was a river raft. Then I guess the water moves it. But a sailboat obviously moves through the water. And nevertheless, if fish jump into it, it's considered a stationary enough courtyard. Certainly it's stationary with respect to you, right, who are on the boat, that the boat will acquire the fish for you. Ravina said to Rav Ashi, if that is so, that one does not acquire items that are placed in his mobile courtyard, then if a woman was walking in the public domain and her husband threw a bill of divorce into her lap, i.e. onto her person or into her basket that she was carrying on her head, here too, is she not divorced because the basket was moving? And Rav Ashi said to him, her basket is not considered a mobile courtyard as it sits idle, and it is she who walks beneath it. Right? So when you divorce, a husband has to give the wife the get. He can also place it in her courtyard, or here we see he can place it in her basket that she is carrying, and she would be divorced. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 1 here in chapter 1. Now let's go on to Mishnah number 2. If one was riding on an animal and he saw a found item, and he said to another person who was walking beside him, give me the item. So if the pedestrian took it and said, I have acquired it for myself, then the pedestrian has acquired it by means of lifting it, even though he did not see it first. But if, after he picks it up and he hands it over to the one riding the camel, he said, well, no, I acquired it for myself when I picked it up, he has said nothing, and the rider keeps the item. That's Mishnah number 2. Now the Gemara. We learned in a Mishnah there in Tractate Peah 4:9, with regard to one who gleaned the produce in the corner of the field, which is given to the poor, right? When farmers harvest their fields, they're pious Jews, they leave the corners of the crops, the corners of the field, for the poor to come along and harvest that for themselves. That's called Peah. So again, with regard to one who gleaned the produce in the corner of the field, which is given to the poor, and this person said, this produce, right, this peah, this produce from the corners, is for so-and-so who is a poor person. Rabbi Eliezer says that he has thereby acquired it on behalf of the poor person. And the rabbis, the majority who disagree with Rabbi Eliezer, they say he did not acquire it for the poor person. Rather, he should give it to the first poor person that he encounters. Do you see why this is? He wasn't appointed by the poor person to collect for him. You could say he's acting for the benefit of that poor person, but does he have a right to do that? He has no right to glean from the corner at all unless he is a poor person. So if he is a poor person, then he has the right to glean and he can acquire for the one that he names. But if he's not a poor person, he didn't have a right to cut that down. And now that he has cut it down, he has to give it to the first poor person that he sees. Ula said that Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi said this dispute is in a case where the payah was gleaned by a rich person who is not entitled to take the payah for himself, and he tried to take it on behalf of a poor person. Now, Rabbi Eliezer holds that migo, right, using the principle of since, if he so desires, he can renounce ownership of his property, and then he would be a poor person, and the payah then would be suitable for him. Now, too, it is considered potentially suitable for him, even though he is wealthy. And since he can acquire it for himself, if he were to give away all his possessions, he can also acquire it on behalf of another poor person as well. And the rabbis hold that we say migo once and we don't say migo twice. Therefore, a wealthy person cannot acquire payah for a poor person. But in a case where the payah was gleaned from the corner by a poor person on behalf of another poor person, then everyone agrees that he acquires it on behalf of that other poor person, as since he can acquire it for himself, he can acquire it on behalf of another. Rav Nachman said, but shouldn't the master say that the dispute is even in a case where the payah was gleaned by a poor person on behalf of another poor person? And this can be proven from the Mishna, as everyone is considered like a poor person with regard to a found item, i.e. everyone has the right to acquire a found item, just as a poor person is entitled to glean payah. And we learned in the Mishnah, if one was riding an animal and saw a found item and said to another person, give it to me, if the pedestrian took it and said, I acquired it for myself, then the pedestrian has acquired it for himself. So granted, if you say the dispute pertains to a case where the payah was gleaned by a poor person on behalf of a poor person, whose opinion is expressed in the Mishnah? It is the opinion of the rabbis, who hold that one cannot acquire an item for another in this manner. But if you say that the dispute is specifically in the case of a rich person and a poor person, but in a case where the payah was gleaned by a poor person on behalf of a poor person, everyone agrees that he acquired it on the latter's behalf, then in accordance with whose opinion is our Mishnah? It is neither in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis, nor in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. Ula said to Rav Nachman, the Mishnah is referring to a case where the one lifting the item said, I intended to acquire the item for myself at the outset. I never had intention to acquire it on behalf of the rider. And the Gemara adds, so too it is reasonable to explain the Mishnah in this manner, as it teaches in the last clause, but if after giving it to the one riding the animal, he said, I acquired it for myself at the outset, he has said nothing and the rider keeps the item. Why do I need the phrase at the outset to be mentioned in the last clause? It is obvious that even if he did not explicitly say at the outset, he meant that he acquired it at the outset before he gave it to the rider. Rather, isn't the phrase mentioned to teach us this? The first clause of the Mishnah is also referring to a case where he said, I intended to acquire it for myself at the outset. And the other sage, Rav Nachman, is of the opinion that the Mishnah taught this phrase in the last clause of the Mishnah in order to shed light on the first clause. The last clause is referring to a case where he said that he acquired the item at the outset in order to indicate that in the first clause, the one who lifts the item acquires it, even in a case where he did not say that he acquired it for himself at the outset. In Rav Nachman's opinion, the rider does not acquire the item until it is given to him. And that concludes our discussion it just concludes what we're going to cover for today. Tomorrow, God willing, after Shabbos ends here in LA, I think last week I got on the air about 7:45 p.m. Pacific, so, maybe 7:45, 7:50 tomorrow night. And then the clocks change tomorrow night. So after that, it's going to get later and later on Shabbos night. Okay, let's take a couple of questions from today's daf, which is Bava Metzia, page 9. My Google Doc is loading slow. Come on, Google. Okay. Dave Garcia, can someone please explain what the red S in the Koran English means? Oh, it's funny. You have the full-size Koran. I have the small Koran. So I think what you're talking about is like this little symbol right there. And it's, I think that's normally used as a paragraph break. But here, what it means is a new topic, right? That we finished that discussion. They argued both sides. And now we're going to go on to, a different discussion, a different argument, a different dispute, a different incident, a different story. And they use that little symbol in the Koran because they have little breaks between every paragraph. When you look in the art scroll, when they're introducing a new topic, then they have a little space between paragraphs. Whereas, normally they break up paragraphs just by having an indent at the beginning of the paragraph, but they only leave spaces between topics. In the Koran, since they have spaces between every paragraph, they use that little symbol to tell you that they're moving on to a new topic. Sharon, a lost animal. We read in so many other places in the Talmud that we keep an animal safe until the owner is found. Under what conditions would an animal be considered findable and can be acquired? Right. So one was somebody who declared it ownerless or died without heirs, and so there was no one to inherit it, and so it's clearly an ownerless animal. In a different situation, where an animal is just found and there's going to be no way to, ascertain who its owner is, that might even be a case where the person finds it, and there's no markings on the animal. There's no tag anyway, so that they don't know any owner to contact. So then they would publicize. Sheep was found. If you can describe it, Sal has it at his house. And then after a certain amount of time, we'd say, okay, it's ownerless. And then the one who acquired it at the outset, it's now his sheep. So that would be the situation. And Melly says, is a camel like God's reserve? I'm sorry, I don't follow the question. I'm not sure what that means. I don't know if you're talking about the fact that camels can go for such a long time without drinking, or if a camel has some kind of a spiritual quality. I'm not sure. But one thing I do know about a camel is that a camel is not a kosher animal. We cannot eat camels. Jews cannot eat camels. But they are certainly kind of the elite transportation animal. In a desert climate, there's no better animal to get you from one place to another when it's hot and you have to go a long distance. That's what I've got for us today, and with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow. Tomorrow night, as I said, when Shabbos ends, it's probably going to be about 7:45, 7:50 p.m. Pacific. May we all be blessed with a rejuvenating, refreshing, joyful Shabbos. We're going to be blessing the coming month of 2nd Adar, in which Purim is coming. So we make Shabbos Mevarchim. So tomorrow, Shabbos morning, we make the blessing because we start the new month. And the new month, I think, begins, I'm not sure if it's Saturday night or Sunday night. We begin Adar Sheni, 2nd Adar, because this is a Jewish leap year, and that'll be the month that contains Purim. But this is definitely a time of elevated joy. And please God, let us celebrate with the hostages who are freed and brought home. May it be today. We say Amen. All the best.